all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Rough Tellis and GovLove co-host. We have a great episode for you today. We're talking strategy in Tacoma, Washington. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. ELGL is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government, and your membership directly supports this podcast, so sign up if you haven't already. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Jacques Colon is the Chief Strategy Officer for the City of Tacoma, Washington, a position he's been in since earlier this month in January 2023, as we record here today. Prior to that, he served as Tacoma's Strategic Manager for about 4 years, and he also worked for the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department as a Health Equity Coordinator. Before he moved to the West Coast, he worked for the National Association of County and City Health Officials and also served as a Teach for America Corps member, I believe in the state that I'm in, so down in South Florida, right?
That's right. Yep, Miami.
Awesome. So Jacques, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
Cool. So we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round to get to know our guest a little better. So my first question for you, what book are you currently reading?
Right now, I'm reading Courage is Calling by Ryan Holiday. It's about Stoic philosophy and how it relates to leadership in today's world.
Cool. Any takeaways so far?
Really having a firm sense of what is within your control and what are conditions that you do not have an impact on, and really focusing on what you do have the ability to control is one of the key takeaways there that I've really been resonating with.
Interesting. Very cool. All right. So my next lightning question for you. What's the last movie you saw in theaters or streamed?
The last movie that I went to the theaters for was actually a special showing of Bo Burnham's special Inside, which was
Nice.
A ton of fun.
Yeah. I can't imagine seeing that with a crowd. That'd be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Lots of singing along. It was a lot of fun.
Oh man. And then what was the first concert that you went to?
The first one that I really clearly remember was Prince.
Oh wow.
It was amazing to see. Yeah.
That's a great first concert, right? That's a cool one to pull out. Like I saw Prince. Yeah. Awesome. But then my last lightning question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
Well, lots of different places. I think the few that I will call out, maybe I'll give you a person, a place, and a thing. I love going to my kids for inspiration.
Nice.
Kids have a really special way of breaking you from thinking about things like an adult sometimes, which can be really useful. The place is the city itself. I personally love taking my lunch break and walking around or driving to new parts of the city that I haven't seen before and just getting a feel for them. Working in local government, I always take something from the feel of a place and what it means to really be there. So I always get in inspiration from, just walking around and seeing all the ways that city government affects the day-to-day, everyday stuff happening around you.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that I'll mention is the book, The Little Prince, Le Petit Prince. I just find of all the things I've ever read, that is the book that I can always come back to for inspiration about what's really important. Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? How do I need to really think about this to keep perspective on what's important moving forward?
Awesome. That's a great answer. So I like the 3-part. That's great. All right, then I'm always curious, about folks' path to local government. So, we covered a little bit about your previous positions in your bio, but I'm curious, how'd you end up in kind of, from your perspective, how'd you ever in kind of the role you're in today in local government? What was your path?
Yeah, I was not one of those people who knows right away that they're going to get an MPA and be on a particular track. But I have always had this strong pull towards public service. And so you probably heard from that intro that it's been a little bit of a circuitous route, but I did start as a middle school science teacher in my hometown of Miami. And that was a really fantastic experience for really understanding all of the experiences that go into the day-to-day lives of, kids in particular. And from there, my story really tracks with my wife's journey. I've been following her for the past 15 years as she has been on her path to becoming a doctor. And so each of her stops along the way in terms of medical school and then residency and then fellowship have been an opportunity to find a different way to serve. And so when we moved to Washington, D.C., I served as a legislative policy analyst and did some advocacy work for a public health organization called NACHO, or the National Association of County and City Health Officials. And then when we moved out here to the Northwest, I found this incredible opportunity as the health equity coordinator for the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department, which allowed me to do work that built on some of the policy work that I had been doing in DC at the local level, and really fell in love with the area and the city, and had the opportunity to come work with somebody that I had formed a really close partnership with, one of my mentors, Tanisha Jumper, who was the strategic manager here at the city before me. And so she was my introduction to the city, and haven't really looked back since. Have really been enjoying this journey and learning what local government looks like.
Very cool. No, I have a similar path where I trailed my spouse a little bit across the country, and so I can totally relate to that. Like, you got to balance that 2-career household, and sometimes that means you relocate and you start over, and you find kind of your path along the way.
Yeah, local government's a great path for that, since it's needed everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. So you mentioned your time as a health equity coordinator. Can you talk about what are some of the types of things you did in that role? I'm just curious kind of what that role entails.
Yeah, great question. So when I think about health equity and my role there as the coordinator, I think that really my main job was to change the narrative.
Mm.
And so when we talk about the narrative about health, one of the things that I would consistently talk about throughout the county in that work was that health was primarily created by the social determinants of health, or the social, economic, and environmental factors and conditions that we live in. And so really thinking about health outside of just healthcare or clinical care, so crucial, because again, the majority of our outcomes are caused or created outside of those clinical settings. So that was one piece of the work, was really changing the narrative about health itself and where health comes from.
Hmm.
And then changing the narrative about equity as well. And so what does equity mean? What does it look like when we talk about health equity? And that work really involved mapping, doing equity mapping work with different health indicators across the county. And through that work and presenting it, really building a shared understanding of how health outcomes really are inequitable in our county, in our city, whatever jurisdiction you're talking about, and why those inequities have come to be. So recognizing that they're not just naturally occurring, that these are the results of historic policies and practices that we continue to perpetuate through the systems that we operate today. And then through that understanding, really changing the narrative about what we can do about it, because ultimately this is about not just understanding, but taking action. And so helping to chart a course for taking action to better achieve health equity through different policies and practices. So we had a couple of initiatives that we ran there, like health in all policies, which is the notion that if most of your health is determined by social, economic, and environmental factors, then when making decisions about social, economic, and environmental things, we should be considering health and equity as part of those decision-making processes. And then another initiative that I'll mention is Communities of Focus, which took a look at that data and the mapping that I just talked about, and really tried to identify where could we focus energy to achieve better outcomes driven by the communities that are experiencing those outcomes, because we know that those communities have the answers to their own issues. They just need to be supported in different ways to be able to act on those. So that's a little snapshot of what I did at the health department.
Yeah, that's fascinating because And I'm curious, like how, and this probably informs your work in your current role, but I assume like some of that work you guys are having to do, that's cutting across other departments in the county and probably partnering with the city. Like so, like how do you kind of say like here's the health outcomes that we're seeing that are maybe problematic and we want to work on, and some of the solutions we're identifying, I in the health department don't have direct control over, or it's going to take collaboration across the board. So I assume there's a collaborative piece of that kind of work with other entities, either in the county or the city, right?
Absolutely. Everything in this work is collaborative, and all of the partners that you mentioned were included in all of this work. Um, and sometimes those actions look different to different audiences, right? So part of it is knowing how to maybe show the data or show the mapping that folks haven't had access to, and then
Mm.
asking questions and facilitating discussion that allows them to synthesize that and come up with what solutions might look like within their particular context. So within all of this, always partnering and always being humble about the fact that you are not the expert in terms of having the answers on what to do, but simply a piece of the pathway towards facilitating the discussion that will get us there.
Yeah, very cool, interesting. Um, so for our listeners that maybe haven't visited Tacoma, can you give us a sense of, or tell us a little bit about the city and I don't know if there's particularly like equity or anything or any kind of areas of that are part of your focus area that you want to highlight that are particular, I don't know, issue areas or problems that you're working on within the city.
This is going to be tough for me because I feel like I could do a whole episode just on kind of hyping Tacoma up.
Yeah.
Tacoma is a fantastic city. Our nickname is the City of Destiny. This land is the home of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. Those were the first people here. They speak the Lushootseed language, and we're right on the border of the Salish Sea,
Mm-hmm.
also known as the Puget Sound. And the Puyallup tribe made their home here since time immemorial, and are known as the welcoming and generous people. And the name Tacoma actually comes from the Puyallup word for Mount Rainier, which is just off in the distance here. And that word is Tahoma. And so that's where Tacoma gets its name from. We're a city of about 220,000 people. We are a deep water port city, so that's a big economic engine for us. There's a lot about Tacoma that folks can come experience from the kind of playground for adventure standpoint. So we're right on the sea. We're right on the mountains. There's forest right outside of the city. We have 13 miles of non-industrial coastline. That's not just the port. We have the mountain right there. So there is an incredible amount of natural beauty and no shortage of things to do around here. Tacoma is an amazing city from the perspective of arts and culture as well. We have arts and cultural stuff happening all around. We have a museum row in our downtown that includes a glass museum because Dale Chihuly, who I think is probably the most famous glass sculptor in the country, is from Tacoma. And there's a bunch of other famous people from Tacoma too, like Frank Herbert, who's the author of Dune, Joe Coy, the comedian, Isaiah Thomas, the recent NBA All-Star, Marcus and Desmond Trufant, who were both in the NFL recently. 10 Things I Hate About You was filmed here. If anybody loves that movie and remembers that high school, that's Tacoma. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is that we are 32 miles south of this other city that's in our shadow that most folks have probably heard of called Seattle. So that gives you a sense of where we are.
Yeah, that small city a little further north. Awesome. Well, thank you. So, the part of what I wanted to have you on was because the city created this new Office of Strategy with So I'm and you're leading it. So can you maybe talk about the intention of this new office? What's kind of going to guide your work, and maybe the team underneath you that'll be kind of doing all this work?
Yeah, so we do have this new Office of Strategy, which is really exciting, and in many ways is going to continue the work that has been building for the past 5+ years. But I think, in short, what this office is being set up to do is to allow the organization to have a strategic approach to confronting complex challenges.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is oftentimes cities confront challenges that are operational in nature.
Hmm.
And there's, of course, strategy involved in, for example, how do we fix our streets to the highest quality or in the fastest way? Or how do we provide X service to our community better? There always is strategy in all of those operational decisions. But there are some challenges that are um, more ambiguous, that are more cross-departmental, that are more long-term in nature. And so those are more of what I would call a strategic challenge as opposed to an operational challenge.
Hmm.
And so our role in this office is to help provide the organization with big picture strategy and direction through strategies such as our strategic plan, Tacoma 2025, um, large strategies like our council priorities,
Mm-hmm.
and then things like our biennial budget that we know direct a lot of our strategy as well. So really influencing those to be aligned as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then separate from the large organizational strategy, there are strategic initiatives and projects that our office also helps to lead. And so those would be, again, cross-departmental in nature, long-term, things like an affordable housing action strategy, an equity index,
Mm-hmm.
the Tacoma Anchor Network. Those are just a couple of examples of some of the initiatives and projects that our office is helping to lead as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to talk more about each of those examples, but I think it's an interesting approach because a lot I would argue like some of those large strategic um, challenge areas they are also interlocking in nature, right? Like equity and affordable housing impact one another, and like
Exactly.
community safety and health impact one another. So like having them kind of having a group to think about and make sure they're aligned and how they influence each of these plans influence each other. It's got to be helpful, I would imagine.
Very much so. We find all the time connections between the different initiatives and projects, and that's absolutely one of the benefits of having this office is the ability to coordinate, combine, braid, all of those words that you want to use to describe how we actually integrate these things into each other to be more effective.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. And what's kind of your relationship with maybe some of those operational departments, like you said, like they may have some strategic thing, but they also have or they have operational strategies and they've got day to day problems they're dealing with, but their work also impacts some of these large strategic initiatives and plans that you guys have. So what's kind of that interaction like as a central strategy office with some of these maybe a public works or parks department that's got maybe more day to day things that are fires to put out and maybe have less capacity to think about some of these strategy things, but are also key partners. All right.
Yeah, first I would say that relationship is one where we help to create some of the large cross-departmental strategies. So using the
Mm-hmm.
affordable housing action strategy as an example, it touches many, if not all of our departments. We can take the role of helping to create that actual strategy document and then guiding each of the respective departments in terms of what their role is,
Mm.
knowing that that's iterative and that we never want to tell departments what their role is, but rather work with them on what that looks like together.
Mm-hmm.
But once that strategy is developed and that guidance has been established, then there is the coordination and facilitation with departments. So,
Mm-hmm.
in the case of the Affordable Housing Action Strategy, we do bring the leaders from each of those departments together to talk about what are our shared priorities, what's the context for upcoming decisions, what do we need to maybe provide a little bit more funding to, at the cost of what? How do we establish those balances together? So those decisions are made jointly through coordination and facilitation that our office provides.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you were kind of alluding to, there always is the operational action at the end of the road.
Yeah.
That's where the rubber meets the road. And for that, we support implementation as needed. And that looks different for different departments and different projects. In some cases, that could be support with particular tools. I mentioned the equity index already, which is really a souped up version of the equity mapping that I talked about before, but providing not just the tool, but the support in terms of how to use the tool, how others have used the tool. That kind of support can really make a difference in terms of helping departments better understand how they can achieve some of the goals in our shared strategies. And then other times implementation might look like something different on the policy side. Maybe it's helping do research on how community prioritization policies have been effectively implemented elsewhere, and then working with departments on how that might get implemented programmatically. So we really are in a place right now where we're trying to set this office up to be flexible enough to respond to all of those different challenges, knowing that we will have to show up in different ways for different challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. Depending on the issue and the people involved and department involved. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So, there's a lot of things you've already mentioned that I want to dig in on, but just to kind of maybe start at the higher level piece that you mentioned first. So you mentioned the Tacoma 25 strategic plan. So can you talk about maybe some of the strategies and goals that are part of that plan, and maybe particularly the ones that your team is most focused on in supporting?
Definitely. So Tacoma 2025 is the city's strategic plan. A couple of just quick context notes. The plan is, when I say a city strategic plan, I mean small C city, not big C city. So it is not just the city government, but all of our partners and community as well. So it's a resident-driven strategic plan that includes goal areas such as livability, economy and workforce, education, civic engagement, and then accessibility. And in each of those goal areas, there are indicators that the community has identified as being particularly important to the vision for the future of the city that they want to see. And so there's actually 24 different indicators that are split between those 5 goal areas. I'll just mention 6 of them because those 6 indicators are what we call our council priorities now. We've worked with our city council over the past several years to really look at our strategic plan and identify some priorities from within that we could help frame, priority-based budgeting within our budget, help frame some policy work that we're doing, and really help directors start to think about things from the perspective of priority areas and objectives as opposed to departments. So I guess with that said, totally lost my train of thought, Ben.
No, the 6 council priority areas, the indicators.
Okay, so the six indicators in Tacoma 2025 that City Council has elevated as their priorities in the past few years are community safety, which the indicator is more Tacoma residents feel safe in their community. Housing and homelessness, which is that more Tacoma residents can afford their housing and transportation at less than 30% of their income. Belief and trust, which is that more Tacoma residents believe that they can have an impact in their neighborhood and have trust in their local government. So that's a really key one that we keep coming back to. And then jobs is the 4th, and that is really around livable wage jobs. We have access to facilities and service. So this would include all of the different forms of accessibility. You can think about language access. You can think about facilities and services like libraries. All of that kind of fits into access, and then health is the final one.
Hmm.
And health is obviously an increased priority for everyone in the past few years. But really thinking about health kind of in the same ways that I started our interview off talking about social, economic, and environmental factors, thinking about
Hmm.
how strategies like our climate action plan and environmental strategies really do create the conditions for a healthy community. So those are the 6 council priorities, which are built out of Tacoma 2025. And those really do give us a really clear sense of direction when we think about where are we moving both council and administratively to achieve the community's vision.
Yeah. No, I love those. Thanks for taking the time to go through those, because that's when I worked on strategic plan at in my past job and then in my current role, like we always talk about outcome measures and like how can you show that you're actually making progress, and each of those indicators are things that I think maybe as an elected official you'd be like, well, we don't have direct control over this, but it's also it's truly measuring the outcome area or the outcome of each area. Like that's great. That's a hard transition to make from the direct counting and hey, these are the things that we can control, the amount of spending or the number of people or the number of widgets, versus like, hey, this is how people experiencing Tacoma, how the experience or the qualitative around their life, how things are changing within the community. So that's great.
That really resonates with me. And yeah, just as a quick side note, I mentioned The Little Prince earlier, the
Yeah.
book. One of my favorite pieces of The Little Prince is he travels to a planet where there's a man who counts the stars. And he keeps asking essentially the question of why. What are you
Yeah.
counting all of these stars for? And sometimes I think about that in our work, similar to what you were just saying. What are we counting is an important question, but why are we counting it is a more important question.
Yeah. No, well said. Well said. So you mentioned the equity index a couple of times. So can you maybe talk more about that and like how the city uses that index, and either through decision making or just to inform kind of conversations?
Yeah, I'd love to. So our equity index, which you can find, it's public facing online if you type in Tacoma Equity Index. It is a GIS mapping system that takes 27 different indicators and lays them on top of each other to create what we're calling a composite opportunity score.
Hmm.
And those indicators are modeled after Tacoma 2025. So those same goal areas that I already talked about, and many of the indicators that I mentioned are represented in the data sets in the equity index. And essentially, with looking at the data around inequities, what you see is that there are maybe differences in how any one particular variable or indicator might play out. But when you start layering different inequities on top of each other, you do see very clear patterns emerge.
Hmm.
And so the beauty of the equity index is that it has all of these different indicators coordinated with each other in such a way where you're able to see very clear patterns of inequity, which can then allow you to make decisions about investments, prioritizing different programs, how to identify particular tweaks to policies that might have better impact in one area than another. And so if you look at the equity index, it shows you all of the census tracts in Tacoma laid out in one of 5 colors that correlate to a level of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And what we are able to do is then pull apart those layers. So if you were particularly interested in just one of those indicators, the index allows you to take that indicator out and look at it by itself as well. So that's the tool in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can click on it and say, I want to look at livability outcomes. And it will show you for all of our livability indicators, which are things like housing cost burden, crime, things like that, would show you an overlay of all of those livability indicators and how the outcomes look across the city.
Hmm.
So that's been really an incredibly useful tool for us in a number of different settings, because if you're thinking about how are we going to come up with a way of being strategic about where we do what, the index really gives us a data-informed opportunity to use this tool to then look at how we can address those inequities. So I'm going to give you a couple of process ways that we do this, and then just a couple of programmatic examples real quick. So process-wise, having a tool like the index is great, but it's only as great as people are willing to use it. And so we've actually incorporated the equity index into our council action memo process, which is what all resolutions and ordinances have to go through before going to council. So you have to actually identify in that memo now, what are you trying to impact? What is the equity index score for the area that you're trying to impact that indicator on? And what does that translate to in terms of how you're going to implement this policy? So that's been a really interesting way of embedding that into the policymaking process. And then we also have the index as part of some of our other processes, like our racial equity action planning processes with departments. So really trying to embed it in how we do business.
Yeah.
And then what that looks like in practice, just a couple of quick examples is love talking about our street lights example, where we have 3,000 plus street lights that need repair, but like many governments, we don't have the money for fixing all 3,000 right at once. So how do we prioritize which of those streetlights to fix first? And before the equity index, we would prioritize it with a lot of really valuable data like car collisions or crime, things like that. We now have the equity index to overlay on top of some of those other considerations to actually change the algorithm that's used for prioritizing those different sites. And so by doing that, we've seen a shift in the prioritization order of those sites. And as a result, we can pretty tangibly see that we are making, from the streetlight standpoint, an increased investment in some of our lower opportunity areas than would have otherwise happened without the tool. And then one other really cool example that I wanted to share from the use of the tool that relates to affordable housing is a lot of us use the multifamily tax exemption as both an economic development and an affordable housing tool. And for those of you that work with the MFTE, you already know this, but for those of you that may not work with the MFTE closely, there are different versions of the tax exemption that have different affordability requirements. The 8-year has no affordability requirement, so it's purely an economic development tool for the most part. The 12-year tax exemption does have an affordability requirement at a particular AMI. And so what we've done as an anti-displacement measure is that we've changed our MFTE policy now to where you are no longer allowed to use the 8-year as a developer if you are developing in an area that is already very high or high opportunity on the equity index. So essentially, if you're going to use the tax exemption in an area that's already experiencing really high outcomes or good outcomes with regards to life expectancy, jobs, and otherwise, there needs to be a return in public benefit in the form of those affordable units. So I think that's a really cool example of how you can use data like this to inform and tweak policy to really make sure that it's achieving the objective that you want.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really cool. That's like a data-driven way to connect, to prioritize, limited resources and also connect things back to those larger goals, right? Those that are in your strategic plan. That's really cool. So we'll definitely link to the equity index in the notes for this episode, so folks can check it out. So you mentioned the affordable housing work. So what's kind of the city been doing in that area, and then any kind of highlights from the action strategy that you guys have that you can share?
Definitely. And you might have to cut me off because I could talk forever about affordable housing. It's so fascinating the deeper you get into the rabbit hole. But the action strategy itself, I should mention, is I believe it's 27 different actions that are split into 4 different objectives. And those 4 objectives are creating more units of affordable housing, preserving more units, helping households stay in their homes that are experiencing a crisis. And then the 4th is removing barriers for people who often experience them. And so, like any great cross-departmental strategy, there are actions in each of those 4 goal areas that are led by different departments. And so we've actually been doing a ton in terms of implementing this strategy. I'll list a couple of them for you, and then please let me know if there's any that you want me to give a little bit more detail around. But I just mentioned our multifamily tax exemption and some of the work that we've been doing there.
Yeah.
We have recently updated our surplus land policy, where a couple of cool things about that now is that when we do have surplus land that we have to bring to bear, we actually give the Puyallup Tribe of Indians first right of refusal on that land to purchase.
Yeah.
And if they are not interested, then the next highest priority item is affordable housing. So we actually have that built into our surplus land policy now to prioritize that end use. And we recently updated it further to include multiple tracks within the surplus land policy to accommodate both rental housing development as well as home ownership development. So that's really cool. One of the other things that we're doing in the creating more housing area is really looking at our zoning, as I know a lot of other cities are doing, and really coming to terms with how single family exclusive zoning is not helping us meet our housing supply goals. And so we actually have a big initiative right now going on called Home in Tacoma, which is looking at revamping our zoning and essentially getting rid of single family zoning and changing to a low scale and mid scale density designation in those areas. And so really looking at how we create the conditions for increased housing supply and increased capacity. So that's really exciting.
That's awesome.
I think that work is going to be crucial to meeting our long-term strategic goals here. And then I'll just list a couple of others. Like I said, we're trying to really match the scale of this crisis with the action. We're doing work with our rental housing code to update it. We've passed several funding policies recently, like the creation of a local affordable housing trust fund, and also passing an additional 0.1% sales tax for affordable housing. We've streamlined our permitting system to prioritize affordable units with a new program. And then we have programs in our housing division that not only help with kind of standard funding for rental development, but we have single family repair and home ownership programs as well. So really looking at the full spectrum of housing needs throughout our community and looking at all the ways that we can try to pull different levers to make affordable housing more attainable for more Tacoma residents.
Yeah, interesting. No, that's fascinating, and such a wide variety of strategies, right? So I'm curious, because you're in this more central strategy type office and supporting this, this action strategy for affordable housing. Do you think that's allowed you guys the cities to explore more strategies that would, I don't know, that are involve different other separate departments compared to like if the planning department owned this plan or the community development department owned this plan, where they might see only solutions that they do as answers to kind of the challenges. Or I'm just curious, like how do you think kind of your guys' role as a central group supporting this plan might impact the strategies chosen or the actions taken, I guess.
Great question. In short, yes, 100%. It absolutely has a huge impact. So having an Office of Strategy lead the implementation of the Affordable Housing Action Strategy has 100% allowed us to make connections that may not have otherwise been there. And that has taken a lot of different shapes. I mentioned the surplus land policy. That was a partnership between our Public Works Real Property Services and our housing division. And being able to facilitate that connection and make sure that that's in coordination with all of our objectives for both home ownership as well as rental unit creation. That's been a really cool example of how that can, we can bring those departments together and make sure that these are mutually beneficial policies. Thinking about the rezoning is another interesting example, this Home in Tacoma project, because there's so much that it impacts in terms of infrastructure, in terms of incentives. So if you think about infrastructure, that's environmental services, that's public works, that's the utilities. When you think about incentives, that's the housing division and some of the other economic programs that we have. And then the zoning itself is planning and development. So there are all these different considerations, and some of them are rate limiting, right? So from the infrastructure standpoint, if that's not thought through, that is going to be a rate limiting step for how much development or capacity you actually are able to achieve. So really excited about the collaboration that we're seeing on that initiative, and feel really good about some of the outcomes that we're seeing as a result of those partnerships.
That's so cool. Awesome. Very cool. So I think you mentioned the anti-displacement component, and I think I read about that as I was prepping for this interview. So, I'm curious about kind of what you guys are doing around that, because I think this is the hardest, maybe not the hardest, but I think it's a really tough challenge cities are in that have affordable housing, issues or crises, where you want to create as much new housing as possible. At the same time, you don't want to displace the residents that want to stay in the city and want to remain and have lived there a long time. So it's kind of in some places it seems like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But I'm curious, like, how you guys are approaching the anti-displacement piece around affordable housing.
It is quite the challenge. Yeah, I heard several years ago somebody talk about development without displacement, and I thought that was one of the niftiest ways to say what we're trying to do in 3 words or less.
Yeah.
But it is such a challenge because there are so many forces that are outside of our control that really make it difficult as city governments to be able to get in front of this. We're so often put in a position where we're reacting to market trends. So that's a huge challenge. But what I would say is, number one, displacement is one of those words that is kind of like strategy in that it means different things to different people. And so a real good step one is understanding what displacement means in your community, because displacement doesn't look the same everywhere. And there are actually different forms of displacement, right? So thinking about whether economic displacement, housing displacement, cultural displacement, which of these are having the biggest impact on your community. For us, our most pronounced crisis is the affordable housing crisis. And so we have lots of data that shows, the driver of displacement for us is really rent increases and how quickly those are happening. And so once you can understand what is the nature of displacement, and sure, if it's obvious that it's about rent increase, well, what does that mean in terms of a menu of potential actions? So that's the next step of our strategy, is not just identifying how displacement looks in Tacoma, including kind of geographies that are at higher risk of displacement. Also looking at demographics. What are the racial components of displacement, and what are the inequities within that we need to be aware of? And then developing a menu of action that matches or reflects the nature of the issue that you've been able to articulate. And so in the case of rental increases, really working with affordable housing developers on not just unit creation, but thinking about who ultimately has access to those units. So we're really interested at looking at what policies like right of first refusal and community prioritization policies could look like, especially if implemented in partnership with some of our affordable housing developers in Tacoma. So those are a couple of the actions, but in general, what we're doing is we are creating a menu of both councilmanic and administrative actions that can be taken. And this will be done as sort of an addendum to our affordable housing action strategy, since this is a crucial component of it. And then working with both council and the city manager on what implementation looks like on both of those sides.
Yeah. No, interesting. I'll have to stay tuned because that's very fascinating. Because I think this is one. I don't know that cities have figured this one out yet, and I don't know that we're as like because often cities, we're about providing services, we're about rebuilding roads, doing utilities, and we don't
Mhm.
often think about the people on the other end of that, and are they,
Right.
and so like that's a shift in mindset I think for a lot of organizations um, that I think is a challenge on top of how do you solve it, right?
One of the other things I really want to mention about the anti-displacement strategy is many places are aware that displacement is happening, and many are also aware that there are significant racial inequities in who is being displaced.
Mm,
We've started to use data that describes the inequities as justification for doing programmatic action that um, does directly address those inequities. So, a couple
mm-hmm,
of quick examples. There was a recent report done here around the demographics of homelessness. And um, the results of that were that people of color are disproportionately represented in the homeless population here. And of those, our Black residents are the most disproportionately represented.
mm-hmm,
Now, using that data, we were able to design our rental and utility assistance programs through ARPA to have a set aside that then partnered with community organizations to prioritize getting percentages of that funding to the households that were at highest risk of displacement. And so we had a target of 50% of the households receiving rental assistance would be led by a person of color. And we have met that and exceeded that target, which is really crucial when you think about what does that mean for the risk that individual families have for displacement. We believe that that is an action that really reflects that inequitable risk. And the
yeah.
same thing is true for other data sources like home ownership. We recently did a home
Mm,
ownership disparity study that showed a very similar trend in terms of Black home ownership being the furthest behind and the most inequitable.
mm-hmm,
And so, again, using that data, we're looking at how foreclosure prevention, down payment assistance, single family rehab, and other programs that are meant to create household stability through home ownership, how can those really be uniquely fashioned to the demographics of the issues that we're seeing. And we're making great progress there. So, my encouragement to everyone else out there that may be listening to this and interested is there are pathways forward in terms of actions that can directly address some of the racial inequities that we see in these
mm.
systems.
Interesting. Well, just out of curiosity, where does the data come from that you're kind of referencing, where you learned about some of these inequities, and also just, I mean, probably also the scope of the problem around displacement and both in terms of rental and homeowner. Where does that kind of data come from?
Well, some of the data comes from reports that are being done by partner organizations. So
Mm,
the Spark report was done as, I believe, a collaboration between the city and the county and national partners
mm,
around what are the racial demographics of homelessness in Tacoma. The home ownership disparity study, that was something that we initiated ourselves because we knew that data was going to be crucial to informing the
mm,
strategy for whatever home ownership actions we took after that. So some data we are happy to collect from others. I can think of the urban displacement data set that we use from Cal Berkeley.
mm-hmm.
Um, that's shows geographic risk of displacement. We use sources like that. But again, the data, if it doesn't take us ultimately where we need to go, there are times where we are more than willing to spearhead the report or the data collection in order to get there.
Very cool. Very
And
cool.
before I forget, Ben, I did want to
Yeah.
mention in terms of anti-displacement, one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that I would really want to share and also encourage others to do is to not just think about displacement strategies as a new thing, but
Mm,
also as a way to tweak what you are already doing. So everything that we're doing in terms of housing, creation, preservation, etc., there are ways that you could think about it with a displacement lens. And so that
hmm,
rental assistance example that I gave, We could have just set up a first in, first out wait list. We could
Yeah.
have set up a lottery only, or we could have done things in a number of different ways, but really thinking about how we could tailor it to affect displacement as one of the key objectives. I think that's a great example that probably pertains to other programs as well. So thinking about everything we do and thinking about, well, is there a different way to prioritize? Is there a different way to partner? Are there additional policies that you could layer on top? Just really want to encourage folks to think about displacement from the lens of how do we tailor what we already are doing as well.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah. Because if this is a goal, let's think about the programs, the policies, the things we're already doing. That's a really good point. Awesome. Cool. Well, on another cool topic that you guys are working on, I read that, as I was prepping for this, that you're going to be working on creating a community safety plan. So I'm not quite sure where you're at in the development of that, but I'm just curious, like, what's the plan for that, and when will that start, and all that good stuff.
What's the plan for the plan?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mentioned that council priority about perceptions of safety and community safety being a priority. This is really in response to that priority, right? People and their perception of safety. One of the things that is really evident is that safety also means different things to different people, and folks throughout our community experience safety in different ways. And so one of the ways that I'm thinking about this community safety plan is very similar to public health and my background. The downstream impacts are often the most visible in terms of, crime and things of that nature. But those are symptoms of the more upstream issues that are really about community conditions. And so the hope is that this community safety plan, in the same way that the Affordable Housing Action Strategy does, can bring together multiple objectives, multiple departments, and really talk about our broader objectives to meet the community vision outside of one particular way of doing things. So I know for some communities, a community safety plan would basically be a crime plan. And that's not what it's going to be in Tacoma. We actually already have a crime plan that our police department has put together. And that needs to be a part of this, since that is a crucial part of what it means for a community to be safe. But it's certainly not the only part. And so in addition to crime, looking at upstream, again, social, economic, environmental conditions and what that means for perceptions of safety. And much like the Affordable Housing Action Strategy, again, figuring out how to coordinate so that we can implement these actions cross-departmentally, but in a coordinated and aligned way. So that's the general plan. But we're going to be looking to examples from other cities, as we know we are not the only ones grappling with these issues, to see how other cities have experienced community safety plans, what their advice is, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, and really learning from others. And then working with departments and partners and the community itself to scope this plan, really figure out what are all the components that have to be in here. And just as an example, livable wage jobs are a huge component of what makes a community feel safe, right? When there are ample, adequate, and accessible livable wage jobs, that has a huge impact on perceptions of safety. Is that something that we want to scope into this plan, as opposed to other things that might be a little bit more straightforward, like alternative response or, community trauma-informed response and things of that nature? So still some work to be done in terms of research and scoping, but really excited about the opportunity to hear from the community and work with partners and departments to figure out what does a collaborative approach to community safety look like.
Way cool. So we'll have to stay tuned and keep a lookout for that plan when it comes out. Awesome. So, I mean, we're at the end of our time together, but we have a traditional, last question for our guests on GovLove. If you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
I love this question. And these complex challenges that we've been talking about today, they are here in our communities, whether we are ready for them or not. And so for that reason, I would love to go out with the Fugees and Ready or Not.
Perfect. We'll get that queued up. That ends our episode for today. Jacques, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Perfect. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can join ELGL by going to our website at elgl.org. And that's where you can also find all of our GovLove episodes at elgl.org/GovLove. And you can also follow us on Twitter at the handle at GovLove Podcast. You can also subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories by sharing this podcast with your friends or your colleagues. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
Up and on their horse. Kick around drinking moonshine. I pour a sip on the concrete for the deceased. But no, don't weep. Wyclef's in a state of sleep, thinking about the robbery that I did last week. Money in the bag, banker look like a drag. I wanna play with pelicans from here to Baghdad. Gun blast, think fast, I think I'm hit. My girl pinched my hips to see if I still exist. I think not. I'll send a letter to my friends. A born again hooligan, only to be king again.
Ready or not, here I come. You can't hide. Gonna find